So another story making the news today is a number of the homeless asylum seekers is soaring, and it's soared by 800% in 2 months. And this is following a change in Home Office policy. Asylum seekers are evicted from hotels in 28 days after their right to stay is granted. I'm now joined by Sarah Nathan to go over this. Sarah, thanks for joining us on the show. You're the co-founder and trustee, of course, of Refugees at Home, Sarah Nathan OBE. Sarah, concerning figures, a boom in refugees, asylum seekers sleeping rough on the streets of London, in particular, intense. What do you believe is driving it?
Well, it's not asylum seekers, of course, it's refugees, people who the Home Office, the government have said, do have a well-founded fear of persecution, are refugees and who have been given leave to remain here. So not asylum seekers, at least. So what's driving it is two things, I think, essentially. One is that to clear the backlog in asylum seekers, the Home Office is making many more decisions than it was. It made very, very few. Well, since before the beginning of COVID, there was a huge backlog. The Prime Minister committed to clear the backlog, which is great in many ways, and the number of decisions made has gone up hugely. And at the same time, the effective length of time that a new refugee gets to find somewhere else to live after they move out of asylum seeker accommodation has been effectively cut from 28 days, which isn't very long, to 7 days, which is virtually nothing. And, think about it. You're in a country you don't live in. Actually, even if you're in a country you did live in, could you find yourself a bank account, a job, income and a home in 7 days? None of us could. I don't see why we expect refugees to be able to do so.
Yes, Sarah, the absolute numbers, the 820% increase, when you look at the absolute numbers, it's 102 refugees sleeping rough. There were 11 in the previous year, so there has been a substantial increase. What would you like to see done? Because presumably they have been granted the right to remain in the country, so therefore they are now legally allowed to work. But at the same time, you're saying they're being evicted from, hotels where they would ordinarily have been, and so they can work, but they're effectively on the streets. What would you like to see done to change the situation, Sarah?
Well, I'd like there to be a longer period in which refugees can find work and accommodation. Nobody gets a job in 7 days, especially if you've only just got your national insurance number. It's really, really hard, and moving on is really hard. People are in hotels, they're in other accommodation, and they're being slung out, sometimes with even less notice. One of the young men who's staying with me at the moment, a Yemeni chap, he was evicted literally on the day he was told the police were going to be told to get rid of him if he didn't leave the house, the hotel immediately. He spent 7 days sleeping rough in Paddington Station, and he came to me and he was in a state of complete shock. I don't think he thought this country could possibly do something like that. I see people every day who have been evicted with a week's notice, 10 days notice, and it's just impossible. You can't find places. I mean, Refugees at Home its referrals have gone up. In November 22, we had 85 referrals in the whole month. This month to date, we've had 259. That's way over 200% increase. October, it was the same, 69 last year, and it was 204 this October. Those sorts of figures. And if you look at, say, what the Big Issue has found, they've done some research across the country, and the councils are saying they cannot cope because figures have gone up sevenfold in Bradford, and almost threefold in Leicester, and 5 times in Coventry. That sort of huge upsurge is bad for everybody. It's terrible for the refugees, but it's not great for the rest of us either. Do we want to see thousands of people street homeless? The Red Cross says there'll be 50,000 refugees street homeless by Christmas. Is that what we want to see? It can't be.
I think, Sarah, a lot of people, and we all agree, homelessness is something that we would like to tackle. There are, 274,000 homeless people throughout the United Kingdom, and this is a small amount, an important amount, of course. But what would you say to people who vent their frustration at the fact that we don't seem able to sort our own homeless problem, and it seems that people who've been in hotels, maybe sometimes for a year at the taxpayers' expense, they are obviously going through a struggle now, but a lot of people would say charity begins at home. What would you say to that attitude?
This is charity beginning at home. It's not helping anybody to evict people so quickly. And actually, people wouldn't need to be in hotels, would they, if they were allowed to work? If the Home Office says you may not work, you can only be dependent, it's a very kind of unconservative thing to do in a way. We're making you dependent, we're not letting you work, and then we're blaming you for it. That doesn't seem right, does it? It seems like a very odd thing to do. Of course, there's a much bigger homelessness problem. It's a huge homelessness problem, and that needs a proper being addressed by policy. I mean, the refugee absolute numbers is quite small. It's just that it has suddenly gone up by such a large proportion as a direct result of Home Office policy in a very few months. And that is startling and I think concerning, whatever your views are about other people who are homeless. All homelessness is bad. We all agreed that. But to make people homeless so quickly from a position where they haven't been allowed to work for maybe a year or 2 years, they haven't been allowed to do anything really, and then suddenly you say, "Wait, you've got status. We believe that you are fleeing war, you're fleeing persecution. Now you're out on your ear with no warning, effectively." I'm not sure who it helps.
And Sarah, what do you say to people like Suella Braverman, who say this is precisely what she was warning about, the growth of tented cities in places like London, and she said homelessness is a lifestyle choice. Do those kind of comments must make you pull your hair out?
It really does. Nobody believes that. I live near the A40 in West London. There's a footbridge over that, and under that bridge were at one point 10 Eritrean young men. And we bought some tents for them, because what was the other option when there were so many so quickly? Were we supposed to leave them out in the rain? Could we have been arrested? Could we have been fined for showing basic humanity to people who were out in the rain because of Ms. Braverman's policy changes? That doesn't seem right, does it?
No. And Sarah, what do you make of the boom in kind of small boat arrivals and the backlog? Surely what you'd like to do is try and solve this backlog to get the claims processed more quickly, so we don't drive people onto the streets.
I would like to see claims sorted more quickly, and that is, as I said at the beginning, an incredibly important thing to do. But I would also like to see that you don't need to cross in small boats in order to claim asylum. Ukrainians don't. You don't see a single Ukrainian in a small boat, and the reason you don't is because they can claim asylum, or effectively claim asylum, online and then pick it up at a visa centre. If we were doing that, you don't. Again, it's a not very conservative thing to do, to attack the supply, when actually what you ought to be attacking is the demand. Of course people will try and cross in small boats, and people will facilitate it illegally. Of course they will, if there's a demand. And if we just keep saying you can only claim asylum if you have landed in the UK, then there is going to be demand. If one has a humane route that you can claim from elsewhere, like Ukrainians, like people from Hong Kong, then you would stop that trade, or you'd massively diminish it. And you wouldn't have these people putting their lives at risk. And that's not great. It's not the smugglers putting their lives at risk. It's the people who are desperate. And again, doesn't help anybody and doesn't solve the problem.
And Sarah, one of the positive aspects of today's net migration figures that came out is the humanitarian visas are 9% down. Sorry, they're 9%. They are down from 19% last year. And presumably that is because the UK has fulfilled its obligations in a fair and proper way to the Ukraine and Hong Kong.
I would hope so. I haven't looked at them in detail, and you'd hope that would be the reason. But they are very different visas. Those visas are very different from ordinary asylum seekers, ordinary refugees. It's a specific scheme, and that's a good thing. But there are a lot of other people. There are Afghans, there are Syrians, there are Yemenites and Eritreans fleeing war and persecution. And we ought to treat those people with some fairness, as well as treating Ukrainians with fairness.
OK, Sarah, Nathan OBE, the co-founder and trustee of Refugees at Home, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon on GB News. Much appreciated.